Hey, Douglas Trevino, Coldwell Banker, Residential Real Estate, and Coldwell Banker Previews International here in Southwest Florida. I want to do a quick video update of something that actually just recently happened and give a little bit of a warning to folks, and also reiterate the value of having an agent who is knowledgeable of the market and really in tune with what's happening, not just locally but internationally, and that's very, very important. Something recently just happened. Actually, I'll give you a little bit of background. Back in well, the early part of the 2002, 2003, somewhere in that ballpark, there were a lot of occurrences of fraud happening, buyer fraud. And a lot of that revolved around the Canadian market and the Chinese market. What would happen are buyers would, most cases, almost every case actually, there would be sight unseen offers that would come through to generally go through agents. Some would go directly to the homeowners if it was a for sale by owner, but it would go through agents, and the offer would come through and look pretty legitimate, with the only exception, the only red flag being it's a sight unseen. And in most cases it was almost a full price offer, cash offer. What ended up happening is these offers would come in, and there would generally be a lower earnest money a deposit offered. In many cases, you know, it depends on the value, the level of the property, but especially if you get into the higher price points, the million plus, you know, generally you look for, I look for personally with my clients, 10% or more. That's not a rule of thumb, it's not a general thing, it's just a preference. Seller to seller. Everybody asks for something a little bit different, and it shows earnestness in making the offer and sincerity. So again, no rule of thumb, but generally the earnest money deposits would be substantially lower than expected. To give an example, and so then what would happen is these offers would come through. The agents at that point really weren't aware of the fraud and wouldn't pursue it. But what ended up happening is the earnest money was made in the form of a cashier's check or a personal check, of all things, and generally in many cases they would be fraudulent, forged, you know, to make it look like they were coming from, let's say, from China, from the Bank of China or any of the Canadian banks up in Canada. And the money would go through, and in some cases they were actually legitimate. The money would go through, but they have different time frames for them to rescind that money. So essentially, to my understanding, what happened was they would make these deposits, and then within the inspection period they would cancel and then request a full refund of their earnest money. So the non-existent money, the one that would rescind or that was never really going to hit the account, would never go through, and the title company or whoever was handling escrow would cut a check of legitimate money back to that buyer. Now this was caught on to pretty quickly, and right now what we and I force the buyers to do or make a decision, they have to wire money. Wiring is the way to counteract that or get around, circumvent that issue, because then the money actually hits the bank and there's ways to secure those funds. Actually, and then this fraud started to fall away. We haven't really seen much of it since the bubble popped, and I just had an experience with one of my sellers where we received, another agent received an offer from a Chinese buyer, and that buyer communicated to him through email only. It's never a phone call, and made a near full price offer, and had a different contingencies, a home inspection and appraisal, of course, and stated they would look for an attorney locally to work with. But all of this was done via email, and the signature on the contract actually was a digital signature, and these days we do use that, and most companies are using that as well. They're secured, but there was never a physical signature either. Now, this person had never seen the property other than, quote unquote, you know, online, had seen videos and things of that nature. So a red flag was raised. We ended up reviewing the contract, and my seller has an attorney, and they presented to the attorney, and the attorney expressed some concerns, as well as we all did, but no one took that step to say, you know, let's investigate this. So at that point we were going to counteroffer. So we counteroffered different terms. The price, of course, was at that point acceptable to my seller. So we had submitted a counter. Well, the next day something didn't sit right with me, and here's where having an agent to protect, you know, your fiduciary or to hold your fiduciary responsibility, protect your interests, is of high importance. These scammers in many cases are very intelligent. And they also will, especially in those cases where the cashier's check is fraudulent, they're almost identical forgeries. I mean, it's almost, they have fooled title companies and attorneys across the board throughout the years here. So it's not as though this is sloppy. This is very smart, and they play a numbers game to, you know, find a few that are going to fall for it and cough up that money in terms of a refund. Nowadays, more people are shooting toward the wire and not accepting personal checks or cashier's checks, which is obviously the smart thing to do. In this case, we had submitted a counteroffer. Well, this bothered me enough to where I spent a good hour to 2 hours researching that night, and went in researching Chinese fraud, and I spoke to a couple of folks who have been dealing with this, who've had it happen to them, and came across a couple of things that absolutely just exposed this for what it was. There was some verbiage in the initial email that this buyer had sent to this other agent. The other agent hadn't said anything, and I found this, and it was almost word for word. So it was absolutely clear. We sent this to our legal department of Coldwell Banker to review it, and I had already written up the withdrawal offer for the counter. So in that case, you know, I was able to save my seller time, critically, now we're in season, time from being off the market, especially under a false offer that was never going to happen. So these things are still happening, and unfortunately, if you don't have representation, how do you know? And we had attorneys involved, we had bankers, friends of my clients involved, and nobody said, hey, you know what, let me research this, and nobody went to that nth degree to say pull out of it. Everybody expressed their concern. Well, that's great, everybody can express concern, and sure, it did sound a little weird, too good to be true. But again, having an agent, this is why I took those steps to actually uncover this and take action and tell my client to take the action to withdraw the offer now, so we don't lose any time or we don't run into any issues. We did end up withdrawing, and the attorney, of course he concurred. But you know, after the evidence I presented. So, you know, this is a case where definitely having an agent to look out for you, because these things happen. And I have never had this happen to me before, ever, in my whole career. But it does happen, and I'm not alone. A lot of agents will get this, and again, this came from another agent. He was seeking the representation of a different buyer's agent. The good news is that buyer's agent also happened to be with Coldwell Banker, so it was easy to communicate with that other agent and express my concerns and such. So this is more of a, you know, a story, but an actual story that just happened, and something to really take into consideration if you have decided to, for any reason, not list with an agent or think that, well, I could do it myself. Well, just be aware these things do happen, and they're getting smarter and smarter. So it's always important to have somebody who's really protecting your interests, and that's the value added benefit of having an agent. It's these things that can happen, and if they do, they can be devastating. You know, and that's something you want to be aware of. So any questions about real estate here, about this scenario, or any other questions about real estate, feel free to call me or email me, 239-410-4460, or you can email me at douglas@purefloridaluxury.com. Thanks so much for watching. Have a great day. Bye-bye.